Hello and welcome to another breakdown video in my planned series on T1 Frigate fits for low-sec and faction warfare solo PvP. These videos are primarily aimed at new players to PvP, which I still consider myself to be. I have a lot still to learn, but I am gaining more experience with each ship and fit I fly, and I want to try and share some of this experience here. I'm back with another Atron fit. This video is an after-action breakdown of the fit used in my Dance of the Atron video posted recently. I was actually trying out two different fits, the same high, mid and low slots for both, but with different rig setups. I will cover both setups here. Unlike in my previous breakdown video which featured a 150mm rail Atron, this fit is more close range brawling with blasters. I had to approach the fights and choose my engagements differently, which made flying it another great learning experience. It also led to some amazing fights. In this video I'm going to take you through the fit and then show how I fly it with some real-time fights. Also, in my last breakdown video I demonstrated some useful features of EFT, which stands for Eve Fitting Tool, and I'll briefly be going back to EFT in this video to help explain some of my piloting decisions. Before we get into the fit, let's have a quick recap at the Atron frigate bonuses. 10% bonus to small hybrid turret fall off, 5% bonus to small hybrid turret damage. So basically it allows you to hit from a little farther out and hit a little harder. So let's go through the fit. In the high slots we have 3 light neutron Tech 2 blasters. No other turret class can match the destructive power of particle blasters, but they also have the worst range of all turrets. The Atron's bonuses to range and DPS means we're making the most out of these guns, allowing us to hit from farther out while maintaining good damage application. I carry 3 different types of charges: Void, Navy Antimatter and Null. Void is a Tech 2 ammo. It provides the highest DPS, but using it reduces your optimal and fall off range, and your tracking speed is nerfed too. Basically, it's most effective up close and while you're heading in a straight line towards your target. Navy Antimatter incurs a 50% reduced optimal range, but no penalty to tracking or fall off. Again, most effective up close, but can deal better with orbiting targets with its better tracking. Null ammo has the lowest DPS, but using it gives you a 40% increase in optimal and fall off range. Tracking speed is reduced by 25%, so best if you're heading in a straight line when using it. It's most effective when your opponent is pulling range or you're having to burn at him from farther out. Each charge is there for a reason and is loaded upon certain types of engagement. We'll look at that when we get into the fights. In the mid slots we have a 1 meganeutron afterburner 2, a warp scrambler, or scram as it's commonly known, and a webifier. The recent module Tiricide doesn't affect this fit too much. You're fighting at such close range that the J5B scram will do fine. If anything, you could swap out the X5 web for a Tech 2 web, producing a 60% speed reduction in your target ship compared to 55% with the X5. The aim of this particular fit is to fight your opponent at close range, making the maximum use out of the DPS from your guns. The Atron is one of the fastest frigates in the game. Its speed coupled with your webifier means you can close down the gap between you and your opponent fairly quickly. In the low slots we have a Tech 2 magnetic field stabilizer, which increases our DPS, a Tech 2 DCU or damage control unit, and a small ancillary armor repairer. On to the rigs. In my Dance of the Atron video I was using 2 different rig fits. Both are equally good in my opinion and led to some very cool fights. The first rig fitting seen here contains dual nanopumps and a DPS rig. With the 2 small auxiliary nanopumps, you are getting a huge boost to the amount of armor hit points repaired during each cycle of your armor repairer. The small hybrid burst aerator increases the ship's hybrid turret rate of fire, effectively giving you more DPS. In short, this rig setup increases your DPS and your active repping amount. The drawback, if you want to call it that, is that you're going to need to train hybrid weapon rigging and advanced weapons upgrade to 5 in order to fit this ship. The second rig fit is your basic hull tank, with 3 small transverse bulkheads in the rig slots. With my skills it adds another 1000 effective hit points to the ship, allowing for that extra survival time, which is useful as your DPS is lower without the DPS rig in the previous fit. Despite the loss of DPS, I managed to win some fights that I thought I was surely going to die in. A lot of fun was had in this fit. I would thoroughly recommend trying out this rig setup. It's not so skill intensive either, requiring advanced weapons upgrades too to fit. That's the fits. Let's go to some fights and see them in action. I'll not be focusing on one rig fit or another, rather more on the choice of piloting and ammo. The first few fights are against micro warp drive fit opponents. These ships tend to want to kite you at range, so it's very important you get on top of them quickly and shut off their micro warp drives. The mechanics of a faction warfare complex make this task a little easier. I'm sitting inside a faction warfare plex here. An Imperial Navy slicer is on short range D-scan and is heading my way. To get inside the plex, he has to take an acceleration gate. This will warp him to a beacon inside the plex. All ships entering faction warfare plexes come out of warp at this beacon, so the plan here is to stay close to it, wait for him to come out of warp and jump his bones, applying my scram and web as quickly as possible. Navy slicers are generally micro warp drive fit and are dangerous little ships. They are fast and have a 25% bonus to their laser turret damage, which can smack you real hard. Notice how I have overheated my scram and web. Doing so increases the effective range of these modules, which just might come in handy if he gets a good start on his micro warp drive. Here he comes. As soon as I see him, I select him in the overview and start spamming approach and activating my overheated afterburner. Watch his speed in the overview. It hits 3 km per second before my scram shuts down his micro warp drive. His first volley takes me to low shield. Within 8 seconds my shield and armour has gone and he is still at half shield. My reps kick in and I've closed range now and my void loaded blasters start to make their mark. Notice I've switched to a keep at range command as opposed to orbit. Remember, void has a penalty to tracking which is going to affect my damage if I am orbiting due to the increased transversal speed. Keeping at range allows the void to deliver its full DPS. The whole fight lasts 20 seconds. This little T1 frigate worth about 10 million just killed 27 million worth of faction frigate. Next up was one of the more memorable fights I've had. Not so much the fight itself, but more because the Garmer is a well-renowned and expensive pirate faction frigate, and killing it in an Atron is just fun. The Garmer can hit 6 km per second on an overheated micro warp drive, and a volley of its missiles hurts bad. It's vital I shut down his micro warp drive as quick as possible so he can't pull range. Remember, I'm in a faction warfare plex, sitting at the warp-in beacon, so the advantage is mine. Same tactic as the slicer. As soon as I see him, I select him in the overview, spam approach and activate my overheated afterburner. Once I know I'm moving, I quickly lock him and activate guns, scram and web. Void is loaded again here. Kudos to him for taking the fight. I'm not sure I would have if I was him, knowing that the Atron that sat inside the plex could very likely shut off my micro warp drive if he was paying attention. The point here is be brave. Just because your opponent outclasses you does not necessarily mean he is going to win. The more experience you get, the more you will understand your ship and fit capabilities as well as your opponents. 70 million worth of ship goes boom. Last of the micro warp drive fights in this video is the trusty Tristan. The Tristan is a very popular frigate due to its fitting versatility. You never really know what you're going to get when you're fighting one. He could be brawl fit, he could be neuting fit, and he could be kite fit with drones. Every Tristan fight I approach, I assume kiting drone boat. Same approach as before. Get on top of him fast, shut off his micro warp drive, and shoot at close range. This is a pretty good pilot. He gets his micro warp drive on fast, bursting past me at speed, and approaching the edge of my scram range. Void is essential here. A skilled drone pilot can do a lot of damage, and you don't have the repping power for a long, protracted fight with his drones. He's shield tanked, and as I'm chewing through his shields, his mate arrives. I know it's probably game over for me, so I just hope to hold on long enough to take him down. First target down, and I start my approach to the second. Stupidly, I had turned off my afterburner, but he had already burned to just outside my web and scram range, and his drones were already on top of me. Rest in peace, Atron. This next fight is against a Duel Rep breacher. Fitted with a medium ancillary shield booster and a small ancillary armour repairer, these can be tough nuts to crack with their bonus to shield booster repairs. Notice I have set up at around 9 km from the beacon. Breachers can carry 2 small drones. My plan in this fight was to kill them first to mitigate some damage while orbiting my opponent at 10 km. The breacher has no bonus to rocket range, and by orbiting at 10 kilometers, he will not be able to hit me and I can concentrate on the drones. I have Navy Antimatter loaded due to it not having a penalty on the tracking speed of my guns. Once I kill the drones, I would then burn in close to kill the ship. The breacher enters the plex and I start spamming the orbit command and lock him up. I have a hostile drones tab loaded on my overview and you'll see me switch to it quickly a couple of times. This is where any drones will show up, but it looks like he has forgotten to launch his drones or something because there are none in space. I decide to forget about the drones and begin a burn towards him. I reload to void ammo and overheat my afterburner. It takes me a few seconds to burn into range. By the time I do, I'm in half armor and have started cycling my reps. This fight is a good demonstration of the hitting power of the blaster Atron with Void and the hull tanking rig I was flying. Despite starting from a disadvantage in the DPS race, the damage of my Void blasters soon start catching. Watch, as I close the gap, more and more of my hits are penetrating his hull. Watch his dual reps as they go up and down. I'm eventually out of charges for my ancillary repper, and it's the hull tanking that ultimately saves me in this fight. On reflection, I think I would not bother going for the drones first, and just go all in with void ammo. Up next is a fight with a dual rep, Blaster and Cursus. Before this fight took place, and after a bit of Z-kill research, I had a good idea he was blaster fit with dual reps. These are very tanky ships and have a bonus to armor repairer amount and to turret damage. They are typically fitted with ion blasters. With this information I planned a different piloting strategy. Going all in with Void may not be the best idea, as his tank will be just too good and he will probably win the DPS race. The Incursus has the same bonus to turret damage as I do. However, the Incursus has no bonus to turret range like the Atron. What I need to do is keep him at range far enough to mitigate his damage, but yet allow me to apply most of mine. Before we view the fight in full, let's pop into EFT and compare both our ships. EFT, which stands for E-Fitting Tool, is a great out-of-game tool for testing ship fits and sizing them up against potential opponents. On the left we have my hull-tanked Atron, and on the right is the Incursus of my opponent-to-be. Look at the EHP of both ships. EHP stands for Effective Hit Points. From what I understand, EHP is the number of hit points your ship can take before it explodes. It does not take into consideration any active repairing modules you have fitted. Comparing both ships, we see the Incursus has the advantage here, with almost 500 more hit points available. Let's look at active defense. This is the amount of effective hit points repaired per second from any active repair modules running. There's a vast gap here. The Incursus dual armor repairers are healing 130 EHP per second compared to the Atron's 57. When it comes to EHP and active repair, the Incursus outclasses my Atron. Can I really take this ship on? Okay, let's look at speed. The Atron is one of the fastest frigates in the game, and unheated, my afterburner gives me 1,200 meters per second. The Incursus sits at 955. The Atron's speed, therefore, is going to allow me to control range of the fight, and at the very least, I know I can outpace him and run if the need arises. What about DPS? Let's take a look at the DPS graph of both ships with void ammo loaded. The DPS graph in EFT displays your DPS versus the DPS of your target's ship at varying ranges. Both ships have void loaded and guns overheated. Void is close range ammo, and right-clicking on the graph at 1000 meters will display my DPS at that range. 209 DPS at 1000 meters with Void. Let's compare that with the Incursus by swapping the attacker and target ships about. Right-click to make the Atron the target and the Incursus the attacker. We now see the DPS graph of the Incursus and our marker at 1000 meters. With Void loaded, the Incursus is doing 159 DPS, 50 DPS lower than my Atron. But I think the Incursus will still win the race here, given its better tank. My additional 50 DPS won't cut it. But notice the Incursus's damage falls off as it approaches the 3 kilometer range. Unlike the Atron, the Incursus has no bonus to range. If we right-click our graph at 3 kilometers, we see the Incursus DPS has dropped to 30. Now let's check the Atron. 144 DPS, 114 DPS greater than the Incursus. That's more like it. If we can keep the distance between the Incursus and my Atron at 3 kilometers, the damage he can inflict is considerably less than what I can do to him. All of a sudden, this is shaping up to be a fight that could be more evenly matched by a bit of piloting knowledge. Before we continue the fight, let's compare DPS with Navy Antimatter instead of Void. Navy Antimatter has a greater fall-off range than Void, which may be advantageous in this fight. Let's load Navy Antimatter into the guns. Going back to the DPS graph, my DPS has risen to 156 due to the increased fall-off range for Navy Antimatter. It is Navy Antimatter I choose to use in this fight. Back to the fight, and you can see I've initiated the keep at range command at 3000 meters and begin the burn toward him. As I slingshot past him, his shields are down and I begin pulling range again. A little too quickly. My ship moves beyond the set 3 kilometers and begins to turn in towards my opponent, which allows him to close the gap a little. I'm not quite sure how to avoid this. Manual piloting, I suppose, but I'm not great at that. Perhaps one of you could offer some advice. I start to pull range again, and by this stage I have him in hull and he's actively repping. Looks like he may have started a bit late on the reps. He has his afterburner overheated, and I'm pulsing my overheat on and off, not wanting to burn out, and trying to maintain enough distance to lessen the damage from his shorter range guns. I really enjoyed this fight, and I'm pretty sure my additional hull tanking played a part, as well as a little bit of responsible piloting. In the next few fights, I'll be using Navy Antimatter exclusively. This is because each fight involves me orbiting my opponent at speed in order to mitigate their incoming damage. And unlike Void or Null, Navy Antimatter does not have a tracking penalty, meaning that even while orbiting at speed, my guns will have a greater chance of tracking and applying damage to their target. It's Atron versus Atron here. I have orbit set to 1000 meters, and I start spamming the orbit command as soon as I see the target in the overview. The main reason I wanted to include this fight is because it demonstrates managing your active repper. I've been in a few fights where I have been running my ancillary repper when I don't need to be, and it cost me the fight because I ran out of nanite repair paste charges. I activate my repper here as I go into armor, but I am aware that he is not hitting too hard. Notice I let the repper run for 2 cycles and I switch it off again because my armor will be back to full strength. No need to rep a fully charged armor tank. I let my armor drop to 50% before I turn my repper back on. In this fight I'm flying with dual nanopumps in the rigs, so the repping power is good and I'm back to full strength after 2 cycles. I switch it off again. His fight is over. Next up for a dance is an autocannon fit rifter. Autocannons have relatively good tracking, but if I can get a close orbit at high speed, it will have an effect on his tracking. I start the fight with a 1500 meter orbit with Navy Antimatter loaded. I'm a bit slow off the mark getting him locked up here. He's shield tanking like a pro. I'm already in reps and I haven't broken through his shield yet. I tighten my orbit to 1000 meters and overheat the afterburner. I'm now halfway through my rep charges, but I notice on the scrolling damage notifications that he's now missing me a lot. I stop my repper briefly here to conserve paste. I'm now out of nanite repair paste to boost my rep cycles, but I finally got through his shields. But wait, he has an armor repper too. This rifter is tanking. I keep my own repper cycling. He's still missing me a lot, and any hits he does land aren't heavy, and I'm definitely dealing more damage here. Butt clenching time as I hit hull, and it's all over. What a great fight. Very memorable. That was one tanky rifter. Let's demonstrate my piloting choice using AFT. Here we have the rifter fit on the right with the Atron on the left. Let's pull up the DPS graph, making Atron the attacker and rifter the target. Right click on the graph at 1000 meters, which is the distance I want to be fighting him at. We see the Atron's DPS sitting at 205. Let's have a look at the rifters. 149 DPS. Considering his tank, this does not look favourable for me. Despite his lower DPS, he will probably out-tank me. But these DPS numbers are relevant for when each ship is pointing directly at each other. That is to say, there is no transversal movement. Look at the two circles at the bottom right of the DPS graph, labelled velocity vectors. You have the attacker velocity and direction in the left-hand circle, and the target velocity and direction in the right-hand circle. By default, these circles depict both ships flying directly towards one another. Watch what happens to the rifter's DPS at 1000 meters when I move the target's ship direction. Remember, the Atron is the target in this graph. I have moved the Atron's direction to a 90-degree transversal angle with the rifter, very roughly simulating a tight orbit if I am understanding this correctly. The rifter's DPS has dropped to practically zero because its guns aren't able to track me. However, we saw from the fight that the rifter was indeed hitting me. This is because in an orbiting fight my ship will not be consistently maintaining a 90-degree transversal angle or a consistent speed, as both ships fight against each other's trajectory in maintaining ranges. The fight will fluctuate between 0 and 90 degrees in all probability, and incoming DPS will fluctuate as a result. Sometimes he'll get good hits, but he'll also miss a lot. If you look back at the rifter fight, you will see this happening in the scrolling damage notifications. It's a rough gauge. That is what I want to show you. Using the velocity and direction tool in AFT can roughly simulate what happens to DPS when you have transversal speed in play. The next fight uses the same tactic. I'm up against a beam-fit Tormentor, another tough little frigate. Beam lasers can dish out some hard damage and have a good optimal range, but they have poor tracking. Let's take a look at the DPS graph before we go to the fight. I'll add the Tormentor as the attacker and the Atron as the target. Look at the velocity and direction circles. With both ships heading towards each other, the Tormentor is dishing out 188 DPS consistently all the way out to 8 kilometers. My Atron can't compete in this range. I need to be close. Look what happens as I increase my transversal at speed. His DPS goes way down because his lasers can't track. In a brawl situation with laser ships, getting into a tight orbit is what you want to be doing. Here he comes. I have my orbit set to 500 meters and my afterburner overheated. My speed initially slingshots me past him, and as my ship banks to turn back into the fight, he gets a couple of good hits on me. This is because my ship has slowed down to make the turn, resulting in my transversal speed being almost negligible. Nonetheless, the Atron is fast and it doesn't take too long for me to get back into the fight. My higher transversal is kicking in and affecting his damage. Keep an eye on the notifications and notice also how much more of my active reps begin holding. Good fight. This next fight was one of the most memorable fights I've had since I started on the solo PvP path. Given what I'd learned about transversal velocities, I really wanted to fight a Federation Navy Comet. These faction frigates have been the scourge of low-sec for me, and I have died many times to a Navy Comet. They generally come in two types, blaster fit like me or railgun fit. Against a skilled blaster fit Navy Comet means certain death, but perhaps against a railgun fit I might just have a chance. Railgun tracking is worse than blasters, and if I can get under their guns, I might just survive long enough to grab a Navy Comet kill. I'm about to go up against said Rail Comet, and also a fairly well-known PvP player. This fight lasts almost 2 minutes, and I'll just run it in real time here with not too much commentary. Same plan as before, tight orbit, high transversal with Navy Antimatter loaded. Things to pay attention to are the scrolling damage notifications, module management, specifically heat conservation on my afterburner and guns to make them last because of the length of the fight. I was flying my hull tanked rigs and they really pay off in this fight, as you'll see. Apologies for the low sound on this footage. Notice how he only has a scram on me. His fit definitely had a web on it too. I'm not sure why he isn't using it. Op success. I wasn't sure I could have won this fight, and to be quite honest, I did a little jig when I did. Hopefully I haven't bored you to tears yet. I have 3 more fights to show. I haven't demonstrated the reason for carrying null ammo in the cargo. Null ammo has the lowest DPS of all the ammo I carry with this fit, but using it gives you a 40% increase in optimal and fall off range. Basically you can hit targets from farther out. There are 2 main reasons for using null. Fights that begin at longer range and fights with dual web fit opponents. Here I'm sitting on a faction warfare acceleration gate and this kestrel lands some 18 kilometers away from me. I tend to assume dual web with kestrels, so my plan here was to just overheat the afterburner and burn towards him as fast as I can in the hope I gain enough speed and distance to get close enough before he webs me and starts to pull range. The gap closes quickly, as incidentally he's also burning to me. If you look closely you'll see I start to do damage from 8 kilometers out. His speed drops as his ship turns and tries to pull range, but by that time I'm right on top of him. Turns out he was shield tanked and not dual webbed. Notice how you can check info on the module aggressed against you by rolling over them. Despite my lower DPS with null, it still hits hard enough to eat through his shield tank and win the fight. I see another kestrel sitting in a novice plex. This one is dual webbed. I take the gate and head into the plex with null loaded and afterburner overheated. He's sitting about 7 kilometers away. Spamming approach and activating my afterburner, I start my burn towards him. I check to see if he is dual webbed by rolling over the module above my HUD, and sure enough he is. My initial burn carries me to 3 kilometers from him before he starts to pull range on me. This is where null is so useful. As he pulls to a 4 kilometer range, my guns are still pounding him and he's repping hard. Another kestrel appears on short range D-scan. Looks like help is on the way for him. My hull tank is really helping out in this fight. His mate arrives in the plex. I keep pushing on, hoping for the kill. My afterburner burns out, along with my scram. I get a final blow and win the fight at around 2% structure, and then I promptly explode as his mate lands the death blow for me. Pretty funny and a great fight. If I had not been using null in this fight, I would have lost. That about rounds up everything I wanted to show you. This last fight is a bonus fight. Sometimes Eve is a harsh master. but at other times a generous giver to the brave. A cloaky Astro and I had been playing cat and mouse in a system for a while. I had been checking out the pilot's Z-kill stats and had decided I could possibly take him on if his past Astro fits were anything to go by. He'd appear and disappear on D-scan, only to decloak as I warped into plexes. I wanted to engage him on my terms, inside a plex and sitting on the warp-in beacon. He popped up again on D-scan at a novice plex and then disappeared again. Throwing caution to the wind, I warped to the gate, where he promptly decloaked and yellow boxed me, but I managed to slip into warp and enter the plex, where I quickly got into position near the beacon. I had him where I wanted him, and now it was time to test if my research was going to pay off. In my haste I had forgotten to hit record until a quarter way through the fight. By this stage we were both in armour, he was actively repping, and I was just beginning my own. Turned out his fit was nothing like what I assumed. He was AB fit with a Duel Rep active armour tank. I was using void ammo in this fight and flying with dual nano rigs. Looking at his speed, it seems he never engaged his afterburner. Even if he had, the Atron's speed still outmatches the Astro, so range dictation is mine. My main concern was the 20% bonus the Astro has to drone damage. In the end, he just couldn't run from the damage of my void-loaded blasters. Another great fight. And the loot fairy said yes. This tough little T1 frigate, which cost me about 10 million, just exploded 140 million worth of pirate faction ship and fit. The Atron continues to surprise me, and I'm having a serious amount of fun flying this often underrated T1 frigate that's helping me learn some of the nuances of PvP. That's the end of this video. Many thanks for watching. I hope it has been somewhat informative despite its length. Please give it a like and subscribe to my channel for future videos in the series.